So the fourth largest country in the world has just become a Bitcoin country. That's right. If you missed the announcement, on Friday at the Bitcoin Miami conference, a governor from Indonesia by the name of Ridwan Kamil came out and made this announcement.
We have the biggest reserve of renewable energy in the world. That's where the Bitcoin minings come to play. In the future, we could be the heaven for a Bitcoin investor.
Now, this announcement is huge because there are over 270 million people in Indonesia, making it more than 50 times larger than El Salvador, who of course was the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender in 2021. And they're not only big from a population standpoint, Indonesia is also the largest economic powerhouse in Southeast Asia, and they're the 16th largest economy in the entire world, which again makes them more than 50 times larger than El Salvador's economy. To understand whether this announcement by Indonesia will open the floodgates of other nation states making Bitcoin legal tender, we need to understand why Indonesia has made this decision today in 2023. We can see that even before this announcement, Bitcoin adoption in Indonesia was huge, okay? This survey here found that Bitcoin adoption in Indonesia was 41%, which is the highest adoption rate in the world, okay? This study was titled The Global State of Crypto Report, and it found that 41% of Indonesians aged between 18 and 75 with an income of more than $14,000 per year own some crypto assets. So this means people in Indonesia could be using stable coins and Bitcoin and other shit coins, and they count that as quote unquote crypto adoption. We can also see that this global survey only really talked to 30,000 people. Yes, it's still a little bit of a small number, but it is a lot bigger than many of the other surveys that we do have looking at adoption in the space. It's also worth noting that Brazil, Singapore, and Nigeria are in the top 5 when it comes to Bitcoin adoption. That'll be more interesting and noteworthy for the latter part of this video, but let's move on to the next section. Why are Indonesians moving towards Bitcoin? Well, we can see here that 50 to 60% of Indonesians are actually unbanked. And let's also remember what made Nayib Bukele make Bitcoin legal tender in 2021, okay? Let's remember, it wasn't a top-down decision where he made his citizens use Bitcoin. Bitcoin was actually spreading from a grassroots level in 2019. I think Bitcoin Beach was a Bitcoin project that was actually created in 2019, and it was growing nicely. So governments respond to what the people want, okay? The people wanted Bitcoin in El Salvador because there was no banking infrastructure and the remittance payments are ridiculously high. Same story here in Singapore with 60% of the population unbanked. We can also see that judging by this study, Indonesia receives around $10 billion in remittance payments every single year. And considering they have such poor banking infrastructure in the country, Bitcoin fixes this, okay? We can also see here that remittance flows have grown exponentially, okay? Indonesia was only receiving $10 million from remittances in 1983, and in 2019, they're receiving 11,000 million, okay? That is an increase of well over 1,000%. That is enormous, and it shows the growing need of remittance payments for these poorer countries in Southeast Asia. And naturally, when 2020 happened, these countries in Southeast Asia were not very impressed because we can see that the lockdowns killed their economies, okay? We can see the remittance flows to Southeast Asian countries dropped dramatically in 2020. So there's a couple of reasons why Bitcoin adoption in Indonesia is so big, okay? Terrible remittance structures, terrible banking system, but we can also see here, Indonesians have felt the pain before. They lived through an enormous financial crisis in the 1990s, okay? This was actually called the Asian financial crisis. You can see inflation in Indonesia spiked to 58% in 1998, crashed back down to still 20% in 1999, and the Indonesians essentially lost 86% of its value when you measure that against the US dollar. We can see here by this chart, the US dollar rallied by 600% against the Indonesian rupee in only 1 year, okay? That's essentially a hyperinflationary collapse. So it was the US dollar bull market in the 1990s that decimated the Asian financial system, okay? All the countries in Asia were absolutely wiped out, okay? Every single time we see a major US dollar bull market and strengthening cycle, it has caused chaos around the world. In the 1980s, that obviously led to the Latin American debt crisis after Volcker raised interest rates from essentially 0 to 20 in the space of only a couple of years. That obviously caused enormous stress in Latin America. I think there were like over 15 examples of hyperinflation. Similar thing happened in the Asian financial crisis. The Dixie strengthened from 78 to 120 in the space of only a couple of years. And all of these Asian currencies, such as Indonesia, suffered immensely, okay? So the Asians were kind of predisposed to find an alternative to the current legacy system that has failed them in their lifetimes. That's a big difference to people in the West today, okay? And then Asia, they've been feeling pretty good for the past 20 years, okay? They haven't had a recession since this financial crisis until 2020. And it kind of reminded people of what happens when the Fed aggressively raises interest rates, okay? So the Fed is currently embarking on its fastest interest rate hiking schedule in history, and Asia could be having a little bit of a flashback to the 1990s, where they suffered from a rising interest rate environment and a strong US dollar. Maybe they're looking a little bit preemptively for an escape route. We can see that inflation has picked up in 2021 all across Southeast Asia. Yes, it is lower than many other countries in Latin America, but it is picking up, and this is causing governments in Southeast Asia to look for an alternative. We can see here from this headline that the US dollar is no longer king as the ASEAN adopts currency swaps. So this association of Southeast Asian countries includes countries such as Myanmar, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Cambodia, Singapore, and of course Indonesia. And they are all fed up with the US dollar, and they want to actually increase their usage of local currencies to reduce reliance on the US dollar. I've highlighted this little quote here from the Indonesian president, who said, "We must remember the sanctions imposed by the US on Russia." This is a recent article that just came out a couple of weeks ago. We can also see here that Indonesia continues its de-dollarization plan, and they are not the only country in Southeast Asia actively looking for a solution and an alternative to the US dollar. So what are my thoughts on Ridwan Kamali's announcement at the Bitcoin Miami conference, okay? Obviously, this was not a legal tender announcement, so most people will say this is nowhere near as big as Nayib Bukele's announcement 2 years ago at the Bitcoin conference in 2021, but it is an enormous signpost of what is going on in Southeast Asia, okay? Indonesia has a population of 270 million people, so the fact that we have a government employee who is in the race to become the next president of Indonesia talking about Bitcoin favorably, it is a very big announcement, okay? I did want to note, yes, he did mention a few buzzwords in his presentation which set off little alarm bells in the back of my mind.
I fight corruption using artificial intelligence. I'm using blockchain technology for my coffee business. I'm using IoT to feed the fish, to feed the chicken.
Yes, so whenever a government official mentions Bitcoin in the same sentence as the Internet of Things and blockchain and using AI to fight corruption, little alarm bells do go off in the back of my head, but he didn't really talk about crypto at all in the whole presentation. So what does this mean? What should we take away from it? I believe that this is just another signpost that China and many of China's neighbors in Southeast Asia are secretly coming up with a Bitcoin plan to de-dollarize their economy. To find out which country is going to make Bitcoin legal tender next, we should look at some of the very interesting developments that has been occurring in Southeast Asia. We can see by this chart here that is tracking the top 10 countries around the world who have the highest Bitcoin adoption. 6 of those 10 countries emerge out of Southeast Asia itself. We can see that those countries include the Philippines, Thailand, India, Pakistan, and, to everybody's surprise, China. But there are also some other countries in Southeast Asia who have postured as if they're going to welcome Bitcoin into their country. We can see here the Kingdom of Bhutan recently got exposed for buying hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin when the bankruptcy filings of Celsius and BlockFi were released. And what's really interesting about the Kingdom of Bhutan is when they were exposed for buying hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin, they did not stop there. They actually doubled down on their decision. We can see here from this little tweet thread that I popped out this week that the Kingdom of Bhutan came out and said, yes, we've been buying Bitcoin since 2019, but we've also been mining Bitcoin since 2019. And this week, they announced a partnership with BitGear, one of the world's largest Bitcoin miners around the world. And they said, we are going to invest another $500 million into Bitcoin mining. So the Kingdom of Bhutan is actually a very fascinating story. I explored it in more detail in that tweet thread on Twitter and in a Substack article. Both of those will be linked in the description of today's video for anyone who wants to check it out. But let's move on. Kingdom of Bhutan is not the only country in Southeast Asia currently stacking Bitcoin. There is also another country that neighbors China. It's called Laos. So this country actually banned Bitcoin in 2018, but in 2021, they actually reversed their decision and said, look, we're going to engage into a Bitcoin mining pilot program as well as a Bitcoin trading pilot program. And we can see here that the country has an enormous amount of hydropower. So they're using that to mine Bitcoin. The government authorized 6 companies to actually start mining Bitcoin. And the government actually expected that they would make $260 million from the Bitcoin mining in 2022. And another country in Southeast Asia that has very high adoption of Bitcoin is the Philippines, okay? The Philippines is an enormous country. They've actually got a population of 110 million people, and they receive the 4th largest amount of remittance flows every single year, which is competing with countries much larger than them, such as China and India. And Philippines is very interesting because they also have some of the best demographics in the world, second behind Nigeria. But they also have enormously high Bitcoin adoption rates. So this little survey here, you can see that Nigeria was estimated to have 32% Bitcoin adoption. The Philippines had 20% Bitcoin adoption in 2020 from this survey, and adoption since then has only risen. And I even have a little bit of anecdotal evidence for you guys. I actually hire a couple of video editors from the Philippines who help to edit these videos, and I pay them with Bitcoin. And it's funny, you can see from this tweet here that they actually asked me to be paid in Bitcoin, okay? So they're great little workers. If you enjoy the quality of the content over here on YouTube that they are producing, feel free to slap a like on it and subscribe to the channel. But let's move on and have a look at Hong Kong. They recently came out and announced that they want to become a crypto hub. That's their words. I think they should be focusing on Bitcoin. But this article here is very interesting because it shows Hong Kong's crypto ambitions with the quiet backing from Beijing. Let's remember, Hong Kong is a Chinese-controlled country, and Bitcoin mining in China is supposedly banned. So it's interesting that Chinese officials have been spotted at these Hong Kong Bitcoin events, and they're apparently okay with what Hong Kong is doing. And the plot thickens even further when you consider that China is still the world's 2nd largest Bitcoin miner despite banning Bitcoin in 2021. That stat really makes you ask the question, who is mining that Bitcoin in China? Why have all of Chinese neighbors seemingly warmed up to Bitcoin, okay? They've reversed their Bitcoin bans. They've been secretly buying Bitcoin for the past 3 years. And Southeast Asia has some of the highest Bitcoin adoption rates in the world. If you want to learn more about what is happening in Southeast Asia and what I think China's secret Bitcoin plan is, you can check out the video right here. And with all that said, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you all in the next one.